After Mohammed, we'll hear from Solomon Negussie Abesha, who is an associate professor at Addis Ababa University in the College of Law and former dean of the College of Law and Governance Studies. His research focuses on comparative constitutional federalism, law and development, and human rights. He serves as a senior resource person in decentralization and governance and has widely published in the areas of constitutional law, taxation, federalism, and human rights. Currently, besides teaching and research, he's serving as a senior legal advisor for the Ethiopian Civil Society Organizations Council and as board chair for a local civil society organization working on promoting dialogue, peace, conflict, and transformation in Ethiopia. We should have plenty of time after their talks for Q&A and discussion. So thank you very much for being here, and please welcome Mohammed.
It is good if it's connected.
Let's see.
Does it work?
Yeah, just that. Do the tech stuff. I haven't done this in here before. Sorry. Oh, it's over there. Oh, yeah, it's over there. Why is it over there? Not here.
We just have to turn on
Well, it's showing up on that one, but not this one. So. Oh, did it turn on? Oh, there we go. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for BYU to invite me to participate in this symposium. This is my second time to be in Utah, so I'm glad to be here again. So my topic is about challenge of implementation of UDHR's provision on freedom of religion, a case from Ethiopia. So how freedom of religion, which is provided under the UDHR, is being implemented, or what are the challenges in implementing these rights in Ethiopia? Just as an introduction, Ethiopia is a very huge country with a very large population. It has 120 million population, only next to Nigeria. It is the second most populous country in Africa. And it is also known for its religious and ethnic diversity. There are so many religious groups in Ethiopia who coexist together peacefully in most cases. So it has a long history of state formation and religious coexistence, except some sort of conflicts and tensions in recent years among religious groups. Both Christianity and Islam in Ethiopia has a long history of mutual coexistence. They coexisted for thousands of years. So religious coexistence is the most common feature of the Ethiopian society. However, respect for religious freedom from the state is usually contested. There was a kind of state-religion relationship in the past in which the state favors one religion at the expense of others. For example, during the imperial regime, there was one state religion in which others were excluded from the state apparatus. The 1931 constitution in Ethiopian history, which is the first written constitution, does not, or it did not recognize religious freedom. It doesn't say anything about religious freedom. But it was revised in 1955, which was one factor for the revision of the 1931 constitution was the coming into force of the UDHR in 1948. Ethiopia was a founding member of the UDHR. It was a founding member, so that it wants to align its constitution with the UDHR, so that there was a need for a revision. So in 1955, it revised the constitution and included some sort of freedom of religion in the constitution itself. But later, when the military regime came to power in 1974 by overthrowing the imperial regime, it recognized religious freedom in the constitution, but it was not practiced because of ideological reasons. Socialism, in most cases, was in direct contradiction with that of religion, because religion was considered as opium of the masses at that time, so that religion has no place in the public space during that time. But later, in 1995, the Ethiopian government introduced a constitution, a new constitution, which incorporated religious freedom as a very fundamental freedom of the citizens. So it recognized separation of state and religion. It recognized freedom of religion for everybody. And at the same time, under its Article 13, it says that all the fundamental provisions of the Constitution should be interpreted in line with the UDHR provision. So any interpretation of any fundamental right in Ethiopia, including religious freedom, it has to be in line or in conformity with that of the UDHR. So this shows that the government or the Ethiopian state recognized or accepted the UDHR as fundamental document to be implemented in its own legal provisions. So my major objective is how the UDHR is being implemented in line with that of this, the Ethiopian constitution or freedom of religion is being implemented in conformity with the UDHR's provisions. My argument is that there was subsequent interference of the state or the government on religious affairs, so that the UDHR provisions is severely restricted in its implementation. And at the same time, co-optation and repression were the major or the most common methods of controlling religions in Ethiopia. So the government, usually, whenever the government is in power, it tries to control religion. So in that sense, the UDHR's provision is not as such fully implemented in the country. And at the same time, those religious freedoms provided as fundamental in the UDHR, for example, freedom of worship, teaching and practice, and manifest one's own religion in public or in private, is severely restricted in most cases. So what does freedom of religion in the UDHR say? I hope we all know about it. Article 18 is the key in the provision of religious freedom in the UDHR. It provides both the internal and the external dimension of religion. The internal aspect is the right to hold one's own religion. Everybody has the right to hold one's own religion. This is an internal aspect of the right to freedom of religion. The external aspect is I have to manifest my own religion publicly or in private or in whatever aspects that I want. So it consists both the internal and the external element. And at the same time, the internal and the external ones are not equally protected. The internal aspect is absolute. There is no limitation from it. There is no restriction from the internal aspect. But the external one may be subject to restrictions, provided that certain procedures are fulfilled. For example, for maintaining public order, for maintaining morality, for maintaining secularism or whatever, the external aspect may be subject to limitation or restrictions. However, in this limitation, the major issue in the Ethiopian context, what I can say, a contradiction between the UDHR and that of the Ethiopian legal system is that the Ethiopian legal system uses secularism as a justification to limit religious freedom. But secularism is not provided as a justification in the UDHR. There are public morality issues, the public order issue, or to protect a just society, in a democratic society, it says. But secularism is not provided as a justification in the UDHR. So, in this sense, there is some sort of contradiction when the government uses secularism as a justification to restrict freedom of religion. The other major problem in the UDHR I observe is that UDHR is a political document. So there is no way to enforce the UDHR if member states are not willing. So it depends on the willingness of the member states. For example, Ethiopia became part of UDHR, and also the constitution recognizes that UDHR is part and parcel of the Ethiopian legal system. But if it fails to implement it, there is no other means to enforce the UDHR in the Ethiopian legal system unless there is simple political commitment from the member states. So that is the major problem I observe. What about the Ethiopian legal system? Does it recognize religious freedom? Yes. The Constitution provides that religious freedom is one of the fundamental rights in Ethiopia. It protects both the internal and the external aspect, like the UDHR. But at the same time, religion is not absolute. Religious freedom is not absolute. Especially the external part is limited or restricted as per Article 27 of the Constitution. For example, there are three important issues in which religious freedom can be restricted. Three things are very important. One is to protect the interest, the fundamental rights of others. Religious freedom may be restricted to protect the interest of others. If there is anything that violates the rights of others, then religious freedom may be restricted. And then religious freedom may be restricted for public reasons. If it contradicts public morality, public order, it can be limited. And it includes secularism as a justification. That is, to protect the state from religion. So, a government may limit religion to protect the state from religion. So, secularism is the most controversial issue in which sometimes there is what is called yesterday, for example, a kind of militant secularism. Not as such to that extent in the Ethiopian context, but there is a kind of aggressive secularism. That means to make the public free from religion, the public space. So in that sense, when the government tries to make the public space free from religion, it sometimes contradicts with freedom of religion provided in the Constitution. So the issue is how secularism is being used and abused in the Ethiopian context to limit religious freedom. So, although secularism is a normative concept which says state and religion are separate, its application is very problematic. Because when you use secularism as a means, the government or the government in power may abuse it, may interpret it in its own interest. So in that case, secularism may be used to limit or to restrict freedom of religion. So in this sense, I have observed several issues in the Ethiopian context where the government limits, for example, wearing niqab, for example, for the Muslims, and worshipping in group or in congregation in public spaces. They are very much limited because the government justifies that this is in violation of the secular principle of the state. So, in this sense, it can be used and abused for limiting religious freedom. Then, in the UDHR context, is secularism really a justification or can be a good cause to limit freedom of religion? There are different studies which say that, for example, from the European context, secularism cannot be a justification to limit religious freedom. So in that sense, although the Ethiopian government uses it as a good cause or a justification for limiting religious freedom, it is usually not applicable universally. So in that case, it contradicts its own constitution when it applies to limit religious freedom. Then, to conclude, religion is the most important issue in human life. There was an assumption in the past, because of modernization, because of secularization, religion will disappear. But this is not true. Religion is even becoming very important in social life now. So it becomes, we can say that it becomes a peremptory norm. That is the most grand right in the world. That is why the UDHR and other universal documents recognized as a fundamental human right. Religion plays an important human life in social, in their cultural, in their political interaction. However, many states are trying to limit religion in a private sphere. Many states don't want religion to appear in public or to be dominant in a public space. So there is a kind of conflict or contradiction in maintaining secularism on the one hand and in protecting freedom of religion on the other hand. So there is a kind of contradiction. Religious leaders, religious groups want to manifest themselves in public, but the state wants to control them at a private sphere. So there is a kind of contestation and conflict between the two values. The state wants to maintain the value of secularism, and at the same time, it wants to maintain religious freedom. So the two contradicts in that sense. So states are gradually dragging into the religious field to control religious groups, religious activities. For example, as we said in the Ethiopian context, the government tries to control religion either through repression or co-optation. That is, providing some sort of benefits for creating leaders that are supportive of the government, and at the same time, it tries to suppress, even by force, whenever there is a need to do that. So, in that sense, we can say that some governments failed even to uphold their own laws, which provides for freedom of religion, to maintain their religious freedom, which is provided in that constitution. For example, Ethiopia, as I said, subscribed to this principle or to these rules of game by adopting its constitution in 1995, and by making the UDHR and other international human rights instruments are integral part of its legal system for protecting freedom of religion. More or less, I can say, more or less, the government tried to maintain it, but at the same time, whenever its actions to protect secularism go beyond the constitutional limits, there is some sort of conflict in that sense. So it uses secularism as an excuse to restrict religious manifestation, for example, in educational institutions and other public places. For example, as I said earlier, wearing niqab, for example, for Muslim women is prohibited in all educational institutions. The justification is to protect education from the influence of religion, and at the same time to protect the security of educational institutions. But it doesn't indicate how wearing these kind of clothes contradicts the security of the state and how it influences education. The free provision of education from religion is not clearly explained, but simply it says as it contradicts the freedom of education to be given free from the influence of religion, it simply protects or prohibits wearing this kind of clothes. Group worship is also restricted in educational institutions for the Christians and for the Muslims. Whatever type of group, whether it is prescribed by their scriptures, their holy scriptures or not, group worship is prohibited in that sense. But in many cases, religious groups claim that group worship is favored by their religion. So in that sense, the government says this is a threat for the state secularity. The other one is co-opting and repressing religious leaders. And institutions also limited the rights of believers to teach and propagate their religion freely. There is a sort of co-optation, meaning recruiting a certain religious leaders in religious institutions which can support the government, and at the same time repressing those religious groups who are assumed to be against the government. So in that sense, I think although it is good for the government to include religious freedom in its constitution, and at the same time incorporating UDHR in its legal system, the practice is a little bit problematic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I concur with Mohammed by thanking Professor Sharfs and his team and Mr. and Ms. Oba for supporting my presence and participation in this important symposium. I was asked to speak about UDHR when we celebrate its 75th year in the coming December. So I thought, what would I say in this commemorative type of event, and speaking for about 10 minutes. So I thought about Ethiopia's involvement in adopting UDHR, and what do we observe after 75 years of adopting this important document. So partly I concur with what Mohammed was saying, and I will try to limit my presentation not to repeat whatever he said. So I will focus on, in terms of chronological approach, what have we observed in making UDHR relevant in the Ethiopian context. It's important to give some background in the form of introduction why this is an important topic in the Ethiopian context. Many writers say that Ethiopia is the home of the three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, in addition to other indigenous denominations. So it makes it relevant to deal with religious affairs in its proper context. So Judaism, 1,000 years, the BC before Christ, and Christianity, the beginning, few years after the coming of Jesus Christ, and Islam, few years after the introduction of Quranic teaching in the Arab world. And we say that Ethiopia is the home of the first immigrants in the globe, where the daughter and his family, Prophet Muhammad's family, came to Ethiopia, and his grandchildren were buried in Ethiopia. We believe that, and the first mosque was built some 1,400 years ago. So we claim that Ethiopia is the home of this religious diversity. And in the form of introduction, it's also important to note that Ethiopia is one of the founding members of UN in 1945, and one of the signing members of the 48 countries who signed the adoption of UDHR in 1948. So it's important to note that. So since then, what did Ethiopia do in making UDHR relevant to its local context? That's my interest. So since the adoption of UDHR, what have we observed? And what are the prospects and what are the challenges, which Mohammed was mentioning earlier? So some of the efforts that we observe in terms of making sense of the adoption of UDHR, as Mohammed said earlier, although the written constitution came in 1931 without reference to the freedom of religion in Ethiopia, and that some attempts in 1955 to incorporate the freedom of religion as a state religion came to an end in 1974. That's people who talk about secularism in Ethiopia take that as a landmark event by abrogating the monarchic system in Ethiopia in 1974, when the revolution brought an end to the system by killing the then Emperor Haile Selassie in Ethiopia. And then since 1974, this secularism has got place in the subsequent constitutional mechanisms. And although secularism was in a way introduced in 1974 by decimating this state religion, Ethiopian Orthodox Church as a state religion, which subsequent emperors should adopt as a state religion in Ethiopia, then how about exercising the freedom of religion and conscience in Ethiopia has been contested, as Mohammed said earlier, in the subsequent years. And over the years, until the coming of this 1995 constitution, we have seen some important incorporations of making sense of this freedom as a relevant constitutional principle in Ethiopia. So, in addition to this freedom, the 1995 constitution was considered as important by incorporating relevant civil, political, social, and cultural rights in its constitution, where 1/3 of its constitutional provisions are dedicated to human rights and freedoms. So the freedom of religion, belief, and opinion is explicitly incorporated in our constitution, and this has been reflected in other subsequent legislations to make sense of this constitutional right. So over the years, although we have several critical observations about religion, and making sense of this constitutional right, what do we consider as a prospect? And to make our presentations balanced, which aspect of the efforts we can consider as prospects making sense of this freedom, and what critical challenges have we observed are the next issues that I would like to speak. So, in terms of prospects, I categorize them into two periods: 1991 to that of 2005, and the second period post 2017. And in these two categories, I would also like to see the challenge and what optimism can we find in these two aspects of making sense of this right. So in 1991, the 1974 approach of secularizing state has got ground in the transitional charter and also in the coming of the constitutions. And if you see this period, we have seen a lot of efforts making sense of rights, not only for freedom of religion, but also for other civil and political rights. And those constitutional rights, freedom of expression, exercising, establishing political parties and participating in the public affairs of the citizens, I would consider that 1992 to that of 2005 was more or less a joyful moment in exercising this right. Many publications were coming out from religious institutions, from political parties, and people were free to express their opinions, to participate in various aspects. But that didn't continue. Following the 2005 election, then severe restrictions of this right, as well as the other civil and political rights, have been observed. So that's it. And then after 2005, the other prospect for this meaningful exercise can be seen in post-2017 period, when we have seen a new prime minister coming to power and expressing joy that everyone can exercise its right without any state intervention, limitations, so that religious institutions can exercise their freedom without restrictions and so on. Civil societies attached to religious institutions or not came to floor where the legislations were revised, so that we have seen some sort of joy in 2018 and 2019. But that didn't last long. So we have seen challenge again. So despite this prospect that we observed since 1991, there are a lot of limitations, restrictions to this freedom, and we have seen people who are affiliated to certain religious institutions sent to prisons. For example, we can take the 2005, the post-2005 government decisions to introduce a different type of teachings to that of Islam, and I don't know the details, but there were a tension between certain groups of the Islamic teaching and the government supports teaching, and therefore many clerks and many religious teachers were sent to prison. So people were afraid, and on Fridays, every Friday, we have observed people chanting against the state, against the government, interfering in their freedom of religion. So this has shown restrictions in the Islamic group. And then the leadership was contested. The government has to bring new leadership, not directly, but as Mohammed said, co-opting these religious institutions through election of religious leaders. So that has been observed, and the situation was a little bit tense. And not only imprisoning, not only accusing religious leaders, but also other legislations which are meaningful to exercising the civil and political rights, and also the freedom of religion, were severely restricted by revising these legislations. So this period can be considered as one of the challenges that we have observed in exercising this freedom. But lately we have also observed, especially in the end of 2022 and the beginning of 2023, the country again entered into a serious tension between the Orthodox Christian community and the government, because there was some kind of schism within the leadership in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and the state has shown affiliation to one of the groups. And that created a serious tension, and God forbids that we didn't go to kind of civil war. That's where I see a wise religious leadership has been observed in the Ethiopian context. So this has not been completely addressed. Still we are in tension, where religious leadership is somehow related to the political leadership, and this favoritism, this attachment, this interference led to some sort of tensions, and still we are living in that sort of challenge. And those legislations which have been revised in 2018, 2019, which I said the prospects supporting the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech, expressions, and so on, now are again subsiding, and these rights are facing some sort of restrictions. And if you have read some reports, now journalists are sent to prison, some religious leaders are again sent to prison, and the tension is still flaring up in the Ethiopian context. Therefore, this has seen seriously a limitation on what this constitutional concept of secularism, the separation of the state. The constitution is clear. The state should not interfere on the affairs of religious and religious institutions and vice versa. So that there is no consensus on what it means, what type of secularism we follow, what should be the role of the state in regulating institutions. For example, there is a clear misunderstanding that many Protestant churches, as we heard this morning, like the Japanese, they are administered, they have independence on every separate church. But this is not the case for Islam and Orthodox Church. Their leadership is completely different. So you cannot establish your own Orthodox Church or your Islamic mosque separate in one particular locality. That's not the case. Therefore, what should the government do in terms of managing, addressing the regulatory responsibilities of the existence of this? That's one of the tension which we have observed released. So, looking into the Ethiopian context and looking into the global perspective on the tension between politics and religion, we can say that there is some sort of liberal interpretations of the freedom of expression and freedom of religion in the West, or West-like way of interpreting this constitutional concept. And there is also a different understanding of this constitutional rights. Because you can see in many countries where hate speech is interpreted in a way saying something bad about another religion. How do we understand preaching one's religion and preaching hate against the other religion? Where is the balance? In the Islamic world, in the Christian world, in our context, there is a different understanding. And that has to be understood properly in order to give meaning to this constitutional right in Ethiopia. So it is also the case in Ethiopia. What does it mean? Now, because of the social media, because of the constitutional right, freedom of expression and so on, people express their opinions, but in a way somehow, sometimes it could appear to be blasphemy, but not prosecuted. Sometimes it could appear to be simply exercising one's right, but propagating one's religious belief on another. So how do we balance that? How do we understand this freedom and to be within the legislations that we adopted, regulating hate speech, regulating extremism, regulating terrorism in those parts of the world? How do we balance that? I don't have an answer, but this is an ongoing discussion in Ethiopia. So as a conclusion, as a concluding remark, although we are bragging about being the first signatories to the UDHR and other subsequent international treaties, which Ethiopia is a party to, there are a lot of issues that is popping out, and we have to work very hard. That's one of the issues. The other is, as I said earlier, although we support about these freedoms, expressions, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, and so on, there is always a tension with that of protecting public interests, and how do we balance that? This is something that we are working with, but we have to engage on addressing these issues. And the other is also about religious followers. I don't want to go deep into that, but if you see how followers practice their religion and tolerating the teachings of others, is not simply an overnight exercise. It requires the generational teachings where one should respect the others of the other religions and so on. So as we celebrate the 76th birthday of the UDHR, we have to think about respecting the right and at the same time properly exercising this right without infringing the rights of others, respecting the rights of others. And do we have hope, for example, in Ethiopia? Do we have hope for that? And my personal observation as a concluding remark, I would say I've been engaged in moderating various interreligious dialogues. In Ethiopia, for example, as Mohammed said, there are arguments that we have been oppressed, we have been doing that and that. So we brought religious leaders, around 100 from every sect, 20 from each and every sect, and we put them in a classroom to discuss about what should we do. Everyone was talking about the grievances. We have faced this in the beginning of 19th century, in the 16th century, in 18th century, or at the middle of 20th century. And finally, they agreed that we have all complaints, but we have to understand the complaints of others, and the only solution is we have to come together and teach how to live in tolerance to each other. How do we respect that? And this is widely shared among the religious leaders, but the teachers, all the religious teachers may not be in that path. So we have to bring that to the lower level where the followers can also do that. And the other is, I have chaired 2 events when the International Fraternity Day on February 4 was celebrated in Ethiopia. We brought all sects of religious leaders and, from all sects, and we discussed about what should we do to bring peace in Ethiopia. Still, that optimism is shared. People talk about fraternity. People talk about living together. And religious leaders, they respect each other and they show commitments. That gives you hope, but we have to do a lot on the ground. And the other hope is, as I said earlier, recently, the tension that we observed in Ethiopia between religious leadership and the political leadership was very, very frightening. So the wise men from these religious institutions helped us to calm down the situation, to just speak to their followers, to respect the rights of others, and to advise the government, if you don't do this, this will not be good. That kind of engagement without abusing the rights of our religious institutions gives you hope. There is some sign of tolerance and respect to each other. With that optimism, I leave you that I hope that the freedom of religion in its meaningful implementation and respecting the rights of others will be the next story that we'll share after some time in this or in another event in this globe. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you both very much. We've got a couple minutes for questions. We have a microphone. So if you have a question, please speak clearly into the microphone. It will be brought to you. Over, please.
I just have a quick question for Dr. Assen. As you were speaking, you were kind of like talking about that the government in Ethiopia, or the constitution in Ethiopia, requires a separation of state and religion. And also in your presentation, you also mentioned that, but that does not exist because the government interferes with religion a lot in limiting religions to actually practice in public spaces, but they limit them into kind of like private spaces. And in my observation, the duty of the government as well is to protect the public, or to protect the people of their own country. And my question is based on those 2 things. Like, why do you think the government is not, or why do you think the people in Ethiopia do not have religious freedom? When it comes to that aspect, the government allows them to worship. Like you have mentioned in the beginning that Ethiopia had, like, both Muslims and Christians lived together for more than 1,100 years in peace. So why do we say the government isn't allowing, or there is no religious freedom in Ethiopia when people are still allowed to practice their own religion, but the government is simply just protecting the public from being influenced by other religions?
Thank you so much. This is a very good question. I think the Constitution clearly provides that state and religion are separate. So it is the responsibility of the government to protect the state from the interference of religion, and at the same time to protect the public from such kind of unnecessary or undue interference of religion in public affairs. But what I am saying is that the government's intervention go beyond that, in the sense that when there is no necessity, for example, to protecting a certain religious freedom to exercise, which does not infringe the freedom of the state from religion. For example, we can take, for example, wearing niqab for a Muslim woman is a religiously mandatory issue to do that. And at the same time, doing this may not interfere in the state affairs. And at the same time, the government does not show any justification for its security reasons. If there is a case, for example, a clear indication that wearing this type of clothes is a clear interference on state affairs, the government has the right to do that because it is its responsibility. Group worship, for example, is mandatory for religious groups. They say that doing group worship is better than having an individual worship. So in that sense, students, for example, in a campus may want to perform a group worship, provided that that should not interfere the rights of others. But what the government is doing is that this kind of activity is simply a threat for the state without having a clear cause to do that. So I'm saying that it is not the responsibility of the government to protect the public. It is its duty, but what it is doing goes beyond the constitutional provision of separation of state and religion. No, thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe it is good to add on this point.
Yeah, Solomon. Yeah.
Yes, Mohammed said on the public interest aspect, but it is also important to note that the relationship between religion and their followers is also another issue. You see, the government has to properly explain why it limits, why it interferes. For example, if you take in the university, the Christians, the Muslims, or when I say the Christian with different denominations, they claim a place for exercising their right. So what do? The government simply restricts their right. Should it allow them? I don't have a space, this and that. A lot of reasons are there. If reasons are not explained, one, and secondly, if that restriction does not apply to all religious followers, then they consider that this is against a particular group where the state infringes on the ground of public interest. So the state has to be careful on restricting and making it applicable uniformly when it has to be uniformly applied, and when it is related to a very specific concern, terrorism, whatever, then it has to say. But there is no this two-way communication sometimes. You speculate and people get a little bit frustrated.
Okay, thank you both very much. The next session is at 12:30, so I think we should probably stop so we can switch. But please take an opportunity to visit with our delegates and ask more questions afterwards, and please join me in thanking them. Thank you very much.